Good afternoon. My name is Swati Taneja, and as a training production director with Informa, I'm delighted to welcome all our attendees today on an informative webinar on icebergs in the desert. Thank you all for being with us today. Before we begin, I'd like to take you through certain housekeeping rules for the next 45 minutes to an hour. The slides that you'll be seeing will be made available on our SlideShare page, and the link will be emailed to you in the next couple of days. The recording of the webinar will also be made available to download, and the link will be emailed to you. Please take the time to complete a post-webinar survey that will pop at the end of the webinar, and you can always type your questions throughout the session in the little window that says questions. Keep typing your questions, and we will allocate enough time in the end for your speaker to address your questions. Now, without further delay, I'd like to hand over to your webinar leader for the afternoon, Phil Griffiths, who's the CEO of the Business Risk Management Limited, a UK-based company, and I hope you enjoyed the next 45 minutes to an hour.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're going to enjoy this webinar with the, probably some of you are thinking, rather strange title of Icebergs in the Desert. As what you said, my name's Phil Griffiths. I do a lot of the training courses in risk management, audit, and similar areas with Informa here in Dubai. Also in-house courses in the region. An iceberg is, to some people, an amazing sight. Some people look at that and go, wow, how amazing. Other people think of an iceberg being the Titanic. So that could be something, of course, that is not necessarily so positive. The one thing that an iceberg has is that usually 10% of the iceberg is above the surface and 90% is below. One of the reasons why perhaps the Titanic was in trouble was that. This is a bit like the world now. If we think about what's happening in the world, there is a turmoil without any doubt. Who thought the oil price could drop quite so much as it did? Now, there's a lot of argument reasons for this. But nonetheless, it has been a little bit of a surprise to people. Maybe there's a bit of an iceberg out there. But if you think of an iceberg as something that provides water, what if you could actually put icebergs in the desert? Maybe you can create sources of drinking water. That is something that, strange as it may seem, is actually being considered. Bear in mind we have water in places that have too much, and we also have that have less. The other thing, if we think about stock markets are going up and down significantly. The question on that is, why is that happening? Is it because our world is becoming less predictable? I think the answer is undoubtedly that's the case. There's a lot of books about this particular subject in terms of what's predictable in the world. They're now talking about the ability to maybe detect problems within our bodies by putting a chip on DNA. Apparently they can already do that now, which will mean perhaps if we move forward, will we need to go to a doctor, or will we need to maybe just go for treatment to a hospital? So there's a lot of issues that are on the surface, but a huge amount underneath it. I think it's very exciting, but equally it brings with it difficulties, concerns as well. So the intention here is to try and just give you some ideas, thought provokers, and things you can be considering within your organization, particularly in this field of, as they call, enterprise risk management, trying to get an understanding of the risks across the business, including, very importantly, the emerging risks, the ones on the horizon. And I think they're some of the most important. So the issue, I suppose, is if everything's changing, and we know there's things like climate change and a variety of issues that are happening, if we have some icebergs, even in the desert regions of the world, how do we actually deal with that? I was fortunate that I went on a holiday to South America the year before last, and I went into an area of the desert where, as far as they know, it's never rained, which is in Peru. And then within 2 days, we were there looking at icebergs in Chile. So these things are not necessarily so separate. What I'm going to try and talk to you about is the link between all these events is risk. And the management of risk will help us. Many governments here now in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and in Doha and in Kuwait and Bahrain are now thinking about how do you encourage and require businesses to manage risk or demonstrate their managing risk. And also, as I've put on this slide, how do you exploit them? How do you develop them? Can you turn a risk into an opportunity? I think the answer is you can. A good way to think of risk, and I use this at quite a number of my seminars, is driving a car. Now, many of you will drive a car, and if you ask people what's the biggest risk in driving a car, some of the things they will often say is other drivers. That's all very convenient, isn't it, really? Is it really the other drivers? Or don't they say the thing about us? So if we look at risk as a car driving experience, when we think, oh, we manage this, the question is, do we? Or do we just assume things won't happen? Let's have a look at some of the issues. We shouldn't speed, but do we? Can you honestly say you haven't driven faster than you should have done in the last month? Not once? I think these days we tend to know where the cameras are, so you slow down when the cameras are, then shoot off the other end when you passed it. Is that really a good thing to do? Probably not. What about seatbelts? Always wear them in the front of the car, but in the back? Maybe not quite so much. We know we should wear them in the back, but I think many people work on the basis that it'll be okay. We won't have a problem. But what if there is a problem? You know, I see children stood up looking out the back windscreen. Is that a good idea? Is that a right thing to do? So if we do this in our everyday lives, isn't it reasonable to assume that your business may not necessarily manage all its risks either? I'm going to try and share with you the idea that risk management isn't really hoping for the best. It's trying to understand the issues. What are those icebergs out there, and how do you make sure you avoid them so you can deliver what you need to do? Another example on the car is, when did you last check your tire pressures? You know, does somebody check them for you? A lot of people say to me, oh, when we do it is when we have a service on the car. Not very good. Your life is dependent on these tires. Maybe that's another thing to think about. Some icebergs here in this particular area? I think there definitely is. I try to use this situation when I work with organizations, particularly on the in-house events on behalf of Informa, and it's a good way to grab people's attention, which is basically saying if we don't manage our risks, then who is going to manage them on our behalf? So we're going to look at some of the issues here. Let's have a look at this sort of iceberg-strewn landscape. Don't see too many here in the UAE, that's for sure. What things can you do regarding key risks? Well, maybe first of all, think about the surprises you've had. Is that something that's discussed? Bear in mind, if you've had a surprise, you don't want another one. Is it okay to talk about surprises? I think so. What's the reason for a surprise? Is that a risk? Not really. A surprise is usually seen to be a risk that you didn't understand fully, or you didn't measure it, or you didn't manage it well enough. And as I've put on here, what about the near misses? What about the things that haven't been disasters, but give you an early warning system? Now, I think this is a very, very good way to think about the risk. What are the icebergs out there? A surprise is sometimes predictable, most often is predictable. There may still be a few things out there which perhaps you can't do. Don't think there's very much, to be honest. Most things you could probably predict. As I say towards the bottom of this slide, why don't you invite your key stakeholders to a risk workshop? These tend to be just done internally. Why not actually bring your customers together into a workshop, key customers? And the last organization that I worked for when I was managing the risk management function, that's what we did. And we asked them, what do you like about dealing with us? What don't you like about dealing with us? What should we change? Similarly with suppliers. You know, maybe supply chain is crucial to you. Do you sit the suppliers down and say, what should we change? How we make things better for you? This is all about risk management, isn't it? And if you don't engage these people, then how do you know you're going to be delivering what they require? I think of also your external stakeholders, maybe government, maybe regulatory bodies. Would you actually have them involved? I think it's a good thing, particularly regulators, because if you have a representative from the regulatory body, when you look at risk management, maybe next time they'll give you a lighter touch. They'll go somewhere else. There are ways of managing this. Other things you can do, and a number of organizations have this already, and if you are, that's great. If not, why not prepare media statements to cover your possible crises or major events? Bear in mind, if you wait till the day it happens, it's too late. You don't want people preparing a media statement immediately after a major issue. And also, who's going to give the statement? What are they going to say? Quite often, one of the biggest issues in enterprise risk management is reputational management. Bear in mind, you can't ensure your reputation, but if somebody says the wrong thing to the press, or it's given a false impression, immediately that's covered in the press and you have a negative impact on your organization. So some organizations are really excellent at this, some not so. Try and have these prepared in advance, and then when if you have the bad luck to have this situation, you know exactly what you want to do. Another idea, one at the bottom here, is to think about maybe incentivizing people, maybe linking risk management to performance management, for example. Risk obviously relates to objectives, the incentives and bonus schemes and so on relate to objectives. Why not link them to risk as well? If you've got some important issues that you need the business to do, why not actually give people some incentive or recognition for dealing with those areas? Share the best ideas. Put something, maybe a little newsletter or something like this to help people get recognition, but also to create the message that this is possible to be done across the business. Another way of looking at this is your risk attitude. Now, an attitude is really related to how much risk you're wanting to take as a business. Are you going to be very risk embracing, or are you a business that perhaps doesn't want to take too much risk? You need to make sure that, importantly, your managers understand what your risk culture is, and indeed the stakeholders, because you might need to manage their expectations. Again, you also need to make sure that you don't think of risk management as being related to compliance, because if you wait until you're required to provide evidence, it's probably too late. So ideally you want things in place already, so that if something does come up, new requirements, new regulations, you've thought about it. Really, risk management is looking forward. Again, you need to make sure that if you go into an area of the sea where there's icebergs, you look out for them and you recognize them. You know, you don't have an unsinkable ship. Well, nor was the Titanic, of course, as it turned out. A way of looking at this is also think about what you say in your corporate statements, maybe things you announce in your corporate governance statements, for example, or in your annual report. Be careful you don't promise too much, because people remember afterwards. We said we're going to do these 8 things, we only did 3. People have long memories. They look back and go, why did you do this? So it's much better to promise 3 and then deliver 5 rather than the other way around. Think about those issues. Think about, as your organization, is there a likelihood it might try and overpromise? Think about whether or not there's then things you can do about that. Here's my little example here. I think this has been photoshopped. Well, I hope it has. And the poor little cat there. Maybe think about the process you use, the risk matrix. A lot of organizations have several risk matrices, maybe one for health and safety, one for procurement, one for finance, one for quality assurance, whatever it is. The enterprise risk management means let's have one. Let's just have one approach and everybody does it in the same way. The nice thing about that, you can bring it all together then, and you can make sure that you can do it as a pyramid approach. What I don't want is this part of the business has a risk matrix which has got 9 boxes, another part's got 16, another's got 25, and they've all got completely different descriptions and criteria. That's not a good idea because you're never going to be able to bring that together. So the recommendation here, and this is very much endorsed by the Institute of Risk Management, and indeed the Institute of Internal Auditors now, is to have one risk matrix, which is corporate level, and you only use that one. You need to make sure that you get that agreed at top management, usually board level, and the descriptions of what those risks will be should also be done that way. As an example of that, what would be a catastrophic impact, what would be a small impact? And you may well find there's different definitions of those. I mean, a catastrophic impact could well be something that you lose your license, or has a huge monetary effect, or leads to multiple deaths, or whatever it is. Now, they are not too difficult to identify, but it requires a bit of effort to be able to look at that. For any of you who would like some information about that one, you've seen my email on the front page. Just drop me an email if you'd like to, and I'm very happy to give you some examples of that to assist you if you are actually trying to sort of develop those approaches. The other thing to look at in terms of risk treatment is the suggestion here. It's not very useful to commit time and money to deal with risk unless you can demonstrate a significant benefit. What you don't want to be doing is wasting your resources, your energy, your money in areas which are not going to be hugely beneficial to you. Almost thinking about this as an opportunity. There is an opportunity to reduce the risk, but if the cost of the risk is 5 million, it's going to cost you 10 million to deal with it, then that's not worth doing. Take the risk. And I think monetary is usually the best because everyone's got budgets, everyone's got things they're trying to deliver. And if you can't make a case for the benefit, it's extremely unlikely people are going to be willing to allocate money towards it. Everyone's got budgets now, and clearly that's a very important issue. And again, there are ways of managing this. Some of these, of course, are highlighted in a lot more depth in my 2 courses on enterprise risk management. Both are to be held later in the year. The dates are on the Informa website. I'll tell you a little bit more of those later on. The other one, risk measurement. Organizations tend to have good measures, key performance measures, but in risk terms, you also need key risk indicators. These are things that are like an early warning system to make sure that you get a little bit of notification before a risk happens. A build-up of complaints, for example, could be one of those. Or indeed, if you're providing services to the public, changes within the structure, service charges that are put in, or indeed changes in the economy could also affect that. If you don't take account of those, the chances are you may well suffer. The other thing about measurement is try and produce something in a graphical approach, something that's in a table or a chart or a heat map, because the board aren't really interested in wading through a list of lots and lots of risks. So if you can provide the information to them in an easily digestible way, maybe they want to know about the biggest ones, maybe the top 10, they're probably not interested in any more than that. And then the level below that, the heads of function, probably needs some of the other ones. So don't over complicate it and don't give them too much. The other thing you should do, here's an example of a brand you probably wouldn't be very much interested in. This comes from the Far East. Acid milk, probably not a clever, well, it probably doesn't mean anything for the organization there, but we probably wouldn't buy it, would you? Measure risk at 3 levels. First, the inherent risk. This is the pure risk. In many ways, that's really how bad could it be? You're trying to work out the worst case scenario here. Very useful for that. Usually that's red because that is the most important level. Some organizations don't actually start at that point. They only work on what the risk is today. That's not the recommended approach, certainly by the Institute of Risk Management, or indeed by the ISO standard for risk management, ISO 31000. The argument is if you identify how bad it can be, you won't be caught out. The residual risk is the risk remaining after you apply your mitigation, your procedures, your control. And also the bit that I think many organizations don't get to is what's your goal? Where do you want to be? Obviously, you want to get through these icebergs. You don't want to just be sitting in front of them all the time. See, the residual risk might be you're not comfortable with it. You might say, do we really need to, can we live with it? No, we can't. Therefore, we need to have some actions to bring it down further. The risk tolerance is your target, your goal. When would you be happy with the risk? Again, if you'd like a bit more information on that one, I can actually demonstrate that to you with various approaches, and you can have a look at the risk registers and so on. Anybody like copies of that, please contact me. The other thing I also believe very strongly in is trying to calculate the cost of poor risk management. If you think of what you could lose off your bottom line, whether in profit or indeed income, depending on the nature of your business, it's very useful to look at this multiplier. How much do you need to get in income or funding or sales to cover every dirham, dollar, real that you lose at the bottom line? That multiplier effect is a very strong figure and gives people an opportunity to recognize how significant this is. Because of course, risk has to be managed, but it's much better to deal with that, and then you don't need as much income, funding, sales, etc. So it doesn't matter whether you're in the government sector or the private sector or even the non-profit sector. This multiplier is a real business enabler. So I would say try and use that. The other thing you've got to do is make sure risks are owned. You've got to create an owner for each risk. It needs to be somebody who can really manage it and be responsible for it. And do not give too many risks to the same manager. You'll overwhelm them. And the chances are if someone's got 30 risks, they're not going to be managing 30 risks. So we need to think about this. The ownership also can relate to what people tend to put forward. As you're probably aware, if people want to get something through, they will tend to understate the risk because they want to get their idea forward. Now, as an organization, that's the last thing you want them to do. So many organizations now require major proposals to be validated and have a risk analysis attached to it. If you have that validated by your risk management function, internal audit, or indeed other parts of the business, if you haven't got those, then it's unlikely they're going to be able to get those things through without it being recognized. The last thing you want from a board point of view is commit to it and then find there are issues that either they weren't told or weren't as accurate as they could have been, or the information was not complete. So I think this is an area, certainly for those of you in risk management or associated with risk management, are really important aspects. Another issue is how to make sure that if your executives are attending meetings, and I'm thinking here of meetings external to your organization, that could be with partners, joint venture people, or even, of course, other parts of government if you're in that sector. Make sure there's a clear brief and in terms of what decisions they can and cannot make. This is particularly important if the main decision maker can't attend and they send somebody who works for them. Are they allowed to make a decision? What you don't want to do is have a decision made that's now binding that you wouldn't be comfortable with. So make sure, and I found this is quite common issue, that people are put in an awkward situation. They go, I don't know whether I can make a decision about this or not. So make sure that before anybody goes to a meeting, particularly in, say it's related to a contract or something like this, or maybe it's in a partnership, that you get an understanding before you go as to what decisions are allowed. And again, talking about this topic, joint venture and partnerships, just because a partnership or a joint venture is effective in year one doesn't mean it will necessarily be in years 2 and 3. So do you have a mechanism for reviewing this? Because you may be very happy in year one. It depends if you're leading or following. I always tend to think 50-50 joint ventures can be a little difficult. Now, they can be very successful. I think if they've been running a long time, yes, but if they're new, the chances are that both partners want to be in charge. 50-50 is very difficult to deliver. Sometimes 60-40 is easier, but make sure there is a method for this. Make sure there's a process. What about projects? Now, they do say, I'm just throwing you 1 or 2 books here on the subject which you look for if you want to. They reckon that project risks are probably the biggest in most organizations. The big question is, how many projects do you know are delivered to time, to budget, and fully met the needs of all the users and the organization's need? This is very rare. And the reason, I guess, is because there's so many things can affect it. So have something specifically in place to ensure that project risk is identified at the very earliest stage. You don't want to wait halfway through the project too late, even before you make a decision ultimately about whether you're going to go or not go with it. Make sure you get people together and ask them to look at it. I do a training course also for Informa on auditing of projects or risk-based auditing of projects. Again, if you are involved in the project area and you're looking to assess it or review it, that's also a training course you might be interested in. That's available in September this year. You will almost certainly have to compromise on one of those 3 elements, i.e. budget, time, or meeting the needs. Decide at the start which of those you're willing to compromise first. A very good example of that would be the metro here in Dubai. That was deemed to open on the 9th of the 9th, 2009. Sheikh Mohammed, of course, said that's the date it's going to be. You can't change that date. You can't be a month later, a year later, not acceptable. Also, and this was done at the start of the project, not the end. They decided this at the start. If we can't deliver it to time, what happens? Well, we have to deliver it to time. Okay, so what else can we compromise? We can't compromise on safety. It's got to be safe. So is there anything else we can compromise? Well, the only thing we can do is we don't deliver the whole thing, i.e. we'll only open certain of the stations initially, which is exactly what they did, because it turned out they weren't fully ready. Now, so you meet people's requirements, and you still deliver it, and that was definitely the best solution. And that was decided at the start. Now, to me, that's what projects should be doing. Don't wait till the end and go, oh my gosh, what do we do now? So risk comes in all these areas. What about the idea of contracts? Here, of course, major contracts, quite often when there is a contract, many organizations don't necessarily decide on the contractor by having a risk workshop with them. Now, if you're going to have $1 billion contract and you've got a choice of 3 contractors, why not spend half a day with each of them and decide which of them are going to be able to manage the risks on your behalf? Give them a brief, say, we'd like you to tell us how you're going to manage these risks. Don't tell them what the risks are. Ask that question. And if they come along and say not really sure, then I probably wouldn't be choosing them. I think I'd be picking one of the other ones who can. Now, these are obvious issues, but I'm quite surprised how often this doesn't happen. All I'm trying to do is give you thought provokers here and things to think about. Again, these are also developed in the risk-based audit of projects course. What about this one, environmental risk? Now, here we are in the desert again. The environment here is precious, and how do you actually protect it? I'm quite surprised that in the region environmental risk is not taken quite as serious as it should be. Also, I'm from the UK. We don't do enough either, for that matter. I went to Scandinavia. They take this really, really seriously, much more so. I mean, how many solar panels do you see here in the region? Not many. And yet the sun all the time. We have solar panels in Britain and it rains all the time. It's a bit strange, isn't it? Do we switch off the lights in the rooms when we leave them? Maybe not. Now, these are not necessarily cost issues, but they are environmental issues, and you've got quite a lot of these areas, which is easy to actually save money as well. Wouldn't it be nice to take some of those? I always think that, when you look at some of these areas, these are easy wins. These are not difficult to do, and it can give you a big plus, particularly if you're trying to get people to take risk management more seriously. Give them some easy wins. I think that's a great thing to do. What about this one? This is something which tends to be called corporate social responsibility, CSR. A number of you might have attended or going to attend events on corporate social responsibility. Again, Informa have courses on that particular topic as well. Why not try and think about the ways to benefit your community, or at least the least able element of the wider community you serve? All your organizations, I'm sure, will recognize your responsibility to the community. Is this something that we discussed in a risk management area? Often not. Now, my views on this are, these are something you can discuss. It is possible for you to highlight issues you should be doing. Bring them along as well and make sure that you are delivering benefits to the wider community. You will certainly get lots of payback for this in the long term. How then do you get your staff to be involved here? I think I've used the word energize quite deliberately, because I think you do want to try and make sure that your staff recognize there's a benefit in doing this. The risks ahead, the icebergs are there. What we've got to do is try and deal with them. I actually took this picture myself. Caution, this sign has sharp edges. Do not touch the edges of this sign. And it says right underneath, you might not be able to read it, it says also the bridge is out ahead. Isn't that what the sign was about? Not the fact it's got sharp edges, it's just, you don't really see that bit. So, I mean, I suppose you're trying to make a point here, that you need to create awareness for staff. Why not put risk management in your induction program? When people join your organization, they hear about certain elements, health and safety, those type of issues, but do they learn about the wider issue of risk? The fact it's going to make a difference to us if we manage risk better. Put it in your staff meeting agenda. It's okay to talk about it. Maybe ask people what frustrates them, what would they change, or how could they make things better? They will give you the ideas. They probably know what happens. Maybe a little newsletter, something here to help. Give the messages out to people. Go for the wins. Give people positive feedback. Recognize good things. Give them an open opportunity to contribute. How do you get your assurance teams involved? Now, a number of you, of course, may well work for an assurance team. Internal audit, quality assurance, insurance, environmental, compliance. There's lots of these teams involved. What tends to happen is they all go their own way. Now, logically, you would want to try and coordinate your efforts. There's no point having two teams go into the same place at the same time. And if you've ever had that, how awkward is it when they say to you, why are you here? We just had a team. But they're different. Well, I'm not sure that's a good idea. In fact, there's now guidance, particularly for internal auditors, by the Institute of Internal Auditors that says you must coordinate your work with other providers of assurance, health and safety, etc., so that you avoid duplication of effort and also you don't miss things. So I would say what you want to try and do is develop something like that. They tend to call it assurance mapping. So in other words, creating a map of who does what, and you can also then maybe agree between yourselves when each of your functions will go. For example, maybe health and safety go in May, internal audit go in August, and maybe the risk management team go in November. There's no reason why you can't do that. Other things you can look at is business continuity planning. Now, these tend to be for the risk events that are very unlikely, but hugely important to you. Sometimes these are called black swans. I think a black swan is because it's very unusual. So it's rare, but it's quite significant. Business continuity planning usually focuses on IT. IT is important, but it's not the only issue, is it? What if you have a problem with the building? You can't use the building. Where's everyone go? It's a little bit awkward, isn't it, really? So how do you make sure that you cover everything and also maybe have a priority sequence of which things do we need to get back, in which order, and most importantly, making sure it's tested. To have a proper test if you can. You know, it's a bit like if you have a fire alarm test, you go, oh, we're all having a test today, everyone walks out, no problem. Don't do that. Maybe do it without giving notice. It's probably a better idea. So there's some ideas in terms of the processes that we go through here. What I've tried to do is give you an overview here of some of the things that you can look at from a risk management point of view, and hopefully giving you a way of understanding and appreciating that the icebergs out there can actually sometimes be your friend and sometimes assist you to stand back and look in. What I am going to try and do now is to sort of throw it over to you. And if you do have any questions or issues or comments you'd like to highlight at this point, I will try my best to answer them for you. We'll just try and get the piece up here. Does anybody have any questions to raise at this point? It's fine if you haven't, that's perfectly okay. If you do have any questions, then I'll try and deal with those on your behalf. I know you are in different roles here. A number of you will be in different departments. If you prefer, of course, you can always send me an email afterwards. You probably saw on the first slide my email address. Please do. It may well be that you feel it's a little awkward to be able to highlight things here. But if you do want any further information, you will get a copy of the slides, as Swati has said before, shortly afterwards. I'll just leave it for a moment or two, and this probably means either I have confused you totally, or hopefully you've understood. Here's a question here, okay? What's the difference between risk appetite and risk tolerance? Yes. Thanks, Mohammed, for that question. Risk, and it's a very good question. People that do get confused with this one. Risk appetite typically is seen to be done at the very highest level. So in other words, as a business, how much risk are you willing to take in achievement of your objectives? So that might be, for example, we're willing to deal with this country, but maybe not this one. Or we will not accept deaths under any circumstances. If you're an airline, it would be, we never have any appetite for a plane crash. These are, if you like, the statements that are made at the top of the organization, the areas there which would be unacceptable to you, or your acceptability for risk. Quite often, if you've got a risk matrix, the risks in the red zone would probably not be acceptable to most organizations as a residual risk, i.e. the risk after controls. Now, risk tolerance, there are some differences of opinion about this. Some of the guidance is slightly different, but the most common viewpoint of risk tolerance is the risk that remains or your goal for an individual risk. So in other words, if you've got a particular risk which you feel we're not happy with at the moment, you're not quite at the level you need to get to, where do you want it to be? So the argument would be, if you bring all those tolerances together for your individual risks, that should come essentially under your risk appetite. If you find you breach that, then you would need to either revise your risk appetite or accept that you need to deal with those risks individually better than you are. So that's the main difference between those two. I hope that sort of gives you some examples. There are some papers that have been produced on this particular subject. If anybody would like copies of those, by all means just send me an email afterwards, and I'll be delighted to send some of those to you. I think the idea of risk appetite and risk tolerance is probably the least well understood aspect of this. So thank you very much indeed for that question. Hopefully that has given you a flavor for that one. Okay. Any other people like to ask any questions, or by all means feedback on that if you'd like, Mohammed. Any more on this one? Okay. Well, if there's things that occur to you afterwards, you can of course listen to this webinar again afterwards. Indeed, of course, if you haven't been able to be here in person or on the other end of this seminar, then you will also still be able to get it afterwards. Risk appetite and risk tolerance are the same. They're not really the same. What happens really is risk appetite would be high level. So you look at this in terms of board level. So where are we, here? Some example of that may, if you're a production environment, you would say we cannot accept things that are more than this % out of our standard because we can't supply them anymore. But you may well have lots of different products, each of which have an individual risk tolerance, and you might have different within that. So for example, you might say overall, we can't accept more than a 5% difference. But within this, but the product range will be this one we can accept 4%, this one we only accept 3% and whatever. So you would sort of maybe have different ones. The risk tolerance will be for individual risks. The risk appetite is the umbrella that covers them all, really. So that's that is a little bit difficult to explain. I do appreciate that. But then no, the way they are seen is essentially risk tolerances for each individual risk, your goal for each risk, where you are going to be tolerant of it, when you're going to accept it, where risk appetite is your organization's view of the risk. So that could be things like country risk, political risk, those type of issues, What are you willing to accept? Example of a risk appetite, we cannot accept significant regulatory non-compliance, which could lead to our loss of our license. That's the ultimate risk, really, isn't it? So risk appetite, we cannot accept anything that could compromise our way of doing business. So that's an example. Hope that's given you something to grab hold of there. Yes, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the way I would certainly cover that. Yeah, risk appetite is generally a broad statement and is done at high level, and the risk tolerance is definitely quantified. So you'll end up with a specific goal or a target for each individual risk. Absolutely correct. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yes. Okay. Well, I would like to thank you all for attending the workshop. And I hope I've given you some food for thought on this one. I say, if you'd like a bit more, please do send me an email afterwards. And I hope maybe I can look forward to welcoming some of you at our ERM and advanced ERM workshops, depending on your maturity in this area. If you go onto the website, you can certainly find out the dates. If you'd like to know specifically those, drop me an email. I'll tell you when they're coming up later in the year. Thank you all very, very much. And I hope I've given you a little bit of food for thought. Thank you very much.